Welcome to the Manny Gumina Podcast, where I showcase stories teaching the decisions to employ for finding your inner compass early in your career. I also toss in lighthearted episodes, typically on beer and basketball. This week, I'm showcasing the research of Dr. Angela Cotellessa. She studied and wrote a dissertation on polymathy. What is a polymath, you might ask? A polymath is an individual whose knowledge spans a significant number of subjects, known to draw on complex bodies of knowledge to solve specific problems. That's long form for a Renaissance man or woman. Think Leonardo da Vinci. It's a subject I'm endlessly fascinated by. I believe cultivating more polymaths in our society can potentially bridge the gaps between seemingly different subjects. Those bridges are gateways to innovation, and innovation is the path forward for solving global crises, climate change and human poverty being the most important in my mind. There are three things we can count on in life: change, taxes, and death. Society has slowly let Ford's assembly line model of specialization creep into all facets of it. We need to change our mindset from Ford's assembly line to solve those global crises. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Cotellessa. And as always, email me with feedback, subscribe to the podcast, and share it with your friends. Dr. Angela Cotellessa grew up in San Francisco Bay Area. When she was 18 years old, she interned for the governor of California before starting college at the University of California, where she was a presidential scholar. After completing her bachelor's degree in psychology and communication, she went on to earn her master's degree, also from USC, in communication management. In 2005, while she was a master's student, she interned at the White House. Since 2007, she has worked in the federal government. More specifically, from 2007 to 2013, she was a non-political career civil servant at the executive office of the president. And since 2013, she has worked at the Center for Leadership Development, where she manages a portfolio of adult learning programs geared at helping non-political employees in the federal government learn and improve their leadership skills. While juggling a full-time job and also early first-time motherhood, Angela earned a doctorate degree in human and organizational learning from George Washington University's Graduate School of Education and Human Development. Her doctoral research and dissertation focused on the lived experiences of modern-day polymaths, people also known as Renaissance men and women. She's a seasoned world traveler, having been to 40 countries on 6 continents so far. In her spare time, she serves as a board member of a nonprofit group called the Alexandria Singers, which she also performs in vocally. She also works in real estate as a part of a family business while living with her husband, Joe, and 3-year-old daughter, Lily, in the Washington, D.C. area. So, Angela, I want to get into a number of subjects, particularly on the subject of polymathy. But first, I want to ask about how did you land the internship for the governor of California, and maybe more broadly, what interested you in the public sector in the first place?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, when I was a little girl growing up, I lived with my grandmother, among other family members. And my grandmother was a voracious reader. So she would frequently take me to bookstores. This is pre-internet days. We'd go to the bookstore, and she was very generous in letting me get any books that I wanted to get. When I was 12 years old, I remember going to the career section of the bookstore, and I found this very, very thick book. It was probably 6 inches thick. That was about internships that existed in the world. I guess that's how we did it back before the internet. They actually printed, listings of that sort. And I remember being this 12-year-old little girl sitting on my bed, flipping through this massive book and sort of highlighting internship opportunities that interested me. And I learned about that you could intern for the governor and that you could intern at the White House. And it sort of planted the seed in me that, oh my gosh, I want to intern at the White House. And I sort of viewed interning at the White House as a later on, like, step down my road. And I thought that perhaps if I interviewed in the governor's office, it would help me get the White House internship. So when I was a senior in high school, I literally remember sitting at a typewriter filling out the application to intern at the governor's office, and I got it. I didn't know anybody, I didn't have connections, I just got in. And yeah, so I spent the summer right after I finished high school interning for Governor Gray Davis, who had just become governor before he was kicked out. So it was a cool experience. And I think it probably did help me become a White House intern later on. And in terms of my interest in public service, I don't know, it was just sort of always there. I remember in high school being interested in government and being involved in political debate and even starting what was called the Junior Statesmen of America Club, a chapter at my high school, and being very involved with that. So I don't know if it was maybe my grandparents' interests in, politics or just innate in me, but it seemed like it would be a respectable topic area to be interested in and impactful in terms of, politics and government impact people's lives fairly significantly, I think. So it was just sort of always there. And it was something that I, pursued as a high school student and as a college student, and even now working in the federal government.
Awesome. So yeah, that answers my question. And maybe this was the summer before you started college then?
Exactly. So I was straight out of high school, going from my high school graduation to move to Sacramento, California, where I interned that summer. So I hadn't even started college yet, but I was registered. I was signed up for college, which they had as a requirement. You had to be, a college student. But I guess the fact that my college was coming that August was enough of being a student for the governor's office.
Yeah. And were there a lot of other, 18-year-olds that were interning at the governor's office, or was this kind of you were one of, and then there's all these 20-year-olds or something?
Yeah, I think I was probably on the younger end. I don't remember any other kids as young as I was at that time, but I might have just not known. Maybe it was possible. But I think most of the interns there were, active college students as opposed to kids right out of high school who hadn't quite started college.
Gotcha. And so you attended the University of Southern California then, and
Right.
How did you make that decision?
Well, I applied to a bunch of colleges that I was interested in. And honestly, I chose USC because I didn't have to pay tuition for 4 years. Like, I got a really good financial aid package there. And it's a great school in terms of, rankings. To be honest, I didn't really want to go to USC because I was used to very small private Christian schools, preschool through 12th grade. My graduating high school class had 100 students in it. So I was used to a very small environment, and I was very intimidated by the University of Southern California, which is a very, very large university. But because of the financial situation, I ended up going there and very quickly ended up loving it. I met so many people from so many different walks of life, and Los Angeles was this new, huge city that I got to explore. So although I was intimidated at first, it ended up being really good for me to go there.
And yeah, that makes sense, right? When you're younger, you think of whatever's not the status quo is kind of dangerous and fearful, and you get kind of these feelings going on. But when you kind of face those fears, you realize that there was nothing to fear in the first place, and it might have been good for your growth. And so what did you end up majoring in there?
Yeah, I started undecided. I didn't really know for sure what I wanted to major in, but my first and second semester, I took classes in psychology and communication, and I really liked both of those fields. And I ended up double majoring in those areas, mostly just because I enjoyed the classes, not necessarily because it was strategic for my future career or going to lead to a high paying job or anything like that. I just really followed my interests and my passions. I chose the two majors that came kind of naturally to me, where I could read something and it just sunk in and I got it. I didn't have to struggle to understand the areas that I was majoring in. So,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, those two majors both, I feel like they kind of connect with just understanding and working well with people. That was definitely an interest of mine, was human beings. And even now in my work for the government in leadership development, and then my doctoral work, my dissertation on polymaths, it all sort of connects to human potential, which is something I've always been fascinated by, is this question of how can I live my best life? How can you live your best life? And so that's really what has driven a lot of my studies in school and even my profession.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue to just maybe fast forward a little bit here from your undergrad and maybe into more of your professional life and the doctorate degree in particular. And I just want to start with, so your dissertation was on the lived lives of polymaths, right? So what is, and we've been kind of scooting around this a little bit while we've been talking here. So, but what is a polymath?
Yeah, a polymath is a fancy word for a Renaissance person. It's someone with expertise and interest across disciplines and fields. They're the opposite of a narrow specialist. So they have a lot of breadth and depth as well, professionally and also in their hobbies, but breadth is a real key. They're not narrow specialists. And because of their breadth and depth, it puts them in a unique position to be able to integrate and be creative and innovative in new ways at the intersections of these disciplines. So I've always been fascinated by people who live that way, who are kind of all in at life and willing to try and explore and experience and be broad and open to varied experiences. So I aspire to be that kind of person myself. And when I had to decide what I wanted to study as a doctoral student and what I wanted to essentially write a book on, my doctoral dissertation, I just thought, I'm going to study that type of person who really just goes all in at life and explores the fullness of the human experience.
Mm. So for those in the audience, or maybe it's not necessarily an audience, but the listenership that is thinking about, you just explained a polymath, what a polymath is, and they're thinking, I might have some of those characteristics. I'm interested in a lot of different subjects, and I really dig deep into many of them at different points in my life. How would you, is there any exercise that helps you understand whether or not you are a polymath? And yeah.
So if you're someone who doesn't want to be a narrow specialist professionally, you might tend to be more polymathic. Or if you really just love trying new hobbies, traveling, reading, having a diverse friend group, that's maybe another indication that you may be a polymath. Curiosity is a hallmark of polymath. So if you love learning, especially self-directed learning, where you sort of identify what you want to learn about next, and you're not just following some prescription of what a teacher told you must learn, then you might be a polymath. If you find it difficult to put yourself in a box or a category, you might be a polymath. If you feel like when you meet a new person, you can always find something to connect with, something to talk with, because you have such broad experiences yourself, you might be a polymath. And on the downside, sort of the more difficult side of polymathy, if you feel like people don't really understand who you are, or maybe you even have to censor some of the storytelling around who you are because people might think you're bragging, or people might not believe you, about your full skill sets and capabilities, you might be a polymath. And if you feel kind of rebellious, like you don't want to follow society's rules, and of course we live in an age of specialization, and the dominant ideology says to be successful, you have to specialize. You have to pick one area of expertise that you're going to focus on for the majority of your waking hours for 30 or 40 years. And so if you say, no, I refuse to do that, I'm going to follow my own passions, even as they morph and change and evolve, then you might be a polymath.
Nice. So the thing that I want to ask, and there's a lot there, there's a lot to unpack there, but I do want to touch on one thing that you had mentioned throughout, that is about self-directed learning. So in comparison to traditional, maybe in some cultures it's not. This is where we were talking a little bit and saying, like, there's not a lot of studies being done on certain subjects, right? And
Right.
but like the self-directed learning part of it, right? So traditionally throughout, at least in my education, I grew up in Wisconsin, and I think this is a lot of the U.S. education system, is just it's basically testing your knowledge of basically memorizing information, right? And being able to test well on it. And then the standardized testing, which helps educators understand where you should be placed in terms of challenging your brain further. And so in comparison to that system, what does like a self-directed learning look like? Is it, obviously that just in the name, it's completely personalized to yourself, but for somebody who's like a polymath and is doing self-directing learning, what does that look like?
Yeah, so it's really about the person deciding what they want to learn about, not a teacher, a coach, a mentor, a parent directing and deciding what you'll learn. That's counterbalanced with the fact that you may decide what you want to learn about, but you may also seek out teachers and more knowledgeable people to learn from. It's not that you can't learn from other people, because that's definitely a part of self-directed learning, where you seek out sources of information. But it's really about taking ownership for your own learning and your own experience and being the driver of it, as opposed to sort of, I don't know if this is the right word, but like the recipient of instructions. And yeah, a lot of our early education, a lot of our educational system is not really based on self-directed learning at all. It's more based on, we're going to prescribe to you what you need to memorize and learn. And that's it. If you can do that, then we will give you a good grade and you'll be successful. The other thing I want to add as well, when it comes to the academic world, I honestly feel a little bit rebellious even writing a dissertation on polymathy, because essentially becoming a doctor in a field means that you have become very, very specialized and knowledgeable and very focused in one area. And I essentially was narrow and focused on not being narrow and focused. Although in the academic world, that's how you become successful. The tenure and promotion process is exactly a great example that you are rewarded in academia for being very, very focused and narrow. And part of what concerns me as an academic is, departments and universities are so siloed. There's very little integrative thought between different departments and divisions in the vast majority of universities. And so when you think about the role of universities, in addition to educating people, of course, another really important role of universities is to create new knowledge, to do research and add to the scholarly literature that exists. And so if the scholarly literature that is being developed is being done so within silos, where disciplines are not really being integrated, there's probably a whole lot of issues and problems that aren't really being looked at in academia, because the people doing the research are very siloed and focused and narrow. So I just wonder, what information don't we have? What knowledge has not been created? What research hasn't been done because of the structure of universities? And it's very disturbing to me when I think about, all this research that's not getting done that could be really impactful for humanity.
Right. And in your experience, probably doing the research, that that definitely came more to the forefront, and the lack of cross pollination in the
Mm-hmm.
academic world. So maybe that kind of parlays into another question, which is, how did you make the decision to do your dissertation on polymathy? And yeah, like you said, there was a risk with alienating yourself from the academic community, which is so focused on specialization. And so how did you kind of make that decision?
Yeah, well, when I first started my doctoral program in 2015, and the professor started talking about dissertation research and writing the dissertation, they kept emphasizing over and over, pick something you're really passionate about that you care about. Because if you just pick something, I don't know, random that you think might be useful, or, just to sort of check a box, it's very difficult to do the research and to finish. And in fact, there's a large percentage of doctoral students who are called ABD, all but dissertation, because they make it through their coursework, they make it through comprehensive exams and never finish the dissertation. So they go through all of that and don't get the doctorate. So just in thinking about, well, what do I care about? What do I want to spend years of my life studying? What do I want to become an expert in? I was really drawn to this idea of human potential, of self actualization, living a good life. And because of some prior experiences in my upbringing, and because of a professor in college that I met, just a whole bunch of experiences, I realized, I want to study people who are Renaissance men and women. When I first started my research as a doctoral student, I didn't even know the word polymath. It took me a while to find the right word. And that I think is part of the challenge of studying this field as well, is that even the word is not that well known. People have heard of Renaissance man or woman, but it's not even a single word. It's kind of like a short phrase. And so that's part of what I've been trying to do in writing my dissertation and post dissertation now, is sort of adding to the discourse so that people do become more aware of this word and this way of living.
Mm. So could you potentially highlight some of the other people who are doing research in this field, or are you the only one to your knowledge? I like from what I could find. I mean, the reason and we were talking about this in the audio green room, essentially, it was like the way that I found you was basically Google search and looking up polymathy, looking up the sources on Wikipedia page, and
Mm-hmm.
there your dissertation was. So like, is there any, and maybe just to highlight the fact that you say that Renaissance men and women. So just as maybe a context for the listenership is, you know, someone like Leonardo da Vinci was, considered one of the greatest polymaths of all time. And during that period, in the Renaissance, is when we discovered a lot about, the sciences and the arts, and just in general, I would say got more intelligent as a human species. And maybe that's that's a huge statement to say, but I do think that, right, history kind of
Yeah.
changed during that period. So like, just getting back to my question, do you know if there's anyone else doing research on polymathy?
Yeah, there are a few thinkers in the field. I will say my doctoral dissertation was the first, and I think still only doctoral dissertation on that subject. So that gives you a sense of how understudied, unfortunately, this field
Mm.
is. The first person in academia who comes to mind, actually, a pair of scholars that are husband and wife, are Robert and Michelle Root Bernstein. They're at Michigan State University. And Robert Root Bernstein, I really consider as the forefather of polymathy studies. He's written a number of articles. He's got a book called Sparks of Genius that he wrote with his wife, Michelle. And he's done some very important thinking on polymathy. There's another set of researchers named Kaufman and Beghetto who have written on it. There's an author with the last name Ivchevich. She's at Yale, who has written on it. Peter Burke. in Cambridge has looked at some of the history, and I'm going to probably pronounce his name incorrectly, but Bharath Sriraman has also done some thinking. But a lot of what those scholars have written about is just sort of looking at individual polymaths one at a time, or sort of theorizing and, making arguments for why polymathy might lead to more creativity or more effectiveness in organizations. But in terms of actual research, studying or doing experiments or anything like that, there's been almost none. I mean, it's very, very, very limited. So my dissertation, which was research, it was qualitative research using a method called phenomenology, which the purpose of phenomenology is to understand lived experience. So what I did is I interviewed a number of different polymaths, both men and women, people who are alive, people who are accomplished but not eminent like a Leonardo. So they're people that you might know in real life. I tried to understand, how did they get to be polymathic, and what is it like, and what sense do they make of it, and what are the pros and cons and challenges and benefits of it. And so being able to find themes and trends among a group of polymaths was a unique contribution of my dissertation. There's also a few other authors I want to highlight. There is a book that came out this year in pop culture, but I can tell from reading it that it was quite well informed by what literature there is on the subject. There's a book called Range by David Epstein, which I highly recommend to anybody interested in the topic. There's also a book that came out this year called The Polymath by Waqas Ahmed. And lastly, there is a researcher and thinker and sort of a colleague of mine named Michael Araki in Brazil, who writes and thinks on this topic as well. So those are a few names to get people started. Of course, there's my dissertation as well. If you Google "In Pursuit of Polymaths, Cotellessa," you'll find my dissertation on ResearchGate for free. And for anyone who might not want to read the whole dissertation, if you just read the last chapter, chapter 5, I think 25 or 30 pages, that's a good overview of my research and findings and themes and recommendations.
Awesome. So what we're maybe this is putting you on the spot a little bit, but what are some of the findings of your dissertation?
Yeah, I'll highlight a couple of the themes that I think were interesting. So in thinking about how did someone get to be a polymath, something that came up in every interview had to do with finances and family. And you may think off the bat, oh, people who become polymathic and highly accomplished, they must have lots of resources and really supportive, wonderful families. And that was the case for some of them, but it wasn't the case for all of them. So some interesting findings were that having a lot of financial resources, for example, could lead someone to become more polymathic, because it meant they could get an education, they could travel, they could have hobbies and take workshops and classes and that sort of thing. So having financial resources could help someone become a polymath. But the opposite was also true. I heard from a number of participants that lack of resources had a sort of forcing function, where if they didn't have money, then they had to figure things out on their own. They couldn't outsource fixing their car or tiling their bathroom, for example. Just throw some possibilities out there. So not having financial resources could also help someone become a polymath. And the same was true. There was another similar split with family sort of functionality. So for a lot of polymaths, they said that they had parents that were supportive and let them explore and sort of lead the way and be self-directed in their learning. And that was very, very helpful to have supportive parents. But I also heard from other participants that having a dysfunctional upbringing also sort of forced them to find a way out. And so polymathy became a way to get more tools in the toolkit. It became a way to mentally escape for some, to go learn and go into a different world and go into books. It became an inspiration to get out and make a better situation for yourself. So I think those were interesting. And what that means for everybody then is no matter your financial resources and no matter how screwed up or not your childhood was, you can take ownership for and make your life the life you want to live. And that's what my interviews conveyed and showed me. Some other interesting themes I found were around polymath identity. So normally, when we are kind of finding our identity as individuals, we usually do that by finding a group or groups that we fit into. And this is what social identity theory says, in fact, is that we get our sense of identity because of the various in-groups that we can find and sort of realize that we match those other people. But polymaths that I spoke with said that they realized they were polymathic because they had such great difficulty fitting in and not finding people who were similar to them in that way. So this is an interesting finding for social identity theory that, yes, many people do get their sense of identity by finding groups to belong to, but for some people, identity may emerge even in the absence of an in-group of polymaths, for example. So those are a couple interesting findings, just to highlight a couple.
Yeah, that's great. And there is a question that I have going off of that, and also just related to kind of both. But you'd mentioned that having the financial resources and maybe the support of a family group could help you become more polymathic. But when you say that, it makes me think of a very specific kind of support, which is you should pursue what you're interested in, and I will let you kind of do that because we have the resources for you to do so. When I think of somebody who might be in the middle, right, where you're not financially struggling by any means, but the money that you do have should go into the right area, and it should and you say you want your child to be successful and whatever that means to you, whether that means they just become a functioning adult and are able to support their family. How would you kind of, and this obviously this is going back to the education thing, but I find and I had a middle class upbringing and whatever, and I found that my parents and parents of my friends were all kind of telling us to kind of specialize in something that's going to get you a good job out of college, right? And a lot of what I'm trying to do with this podcast is related to that. But so what do you recommend? Is there anything that you would find or anything that you would recommend for somebody in that situation where, their skill set, they feel that they have a diverse skill set, they can delve into a number of different subjects and kind of connect the dots and make something greater than the sum of the parts out of that. But society is kind of telling them to specialize, go become a doctor, become a lawyer, that type of thing. Mm-hmm. So how do you kind of recommend going about that as maybe somebody who's younger but then also for society as a whole to kind of think about in that way?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I want to give another shout out to David Epstein in his book Range. He did a great job in that book of sort of explaining the benefits of delayed specialization if you are going to specialize. And basically what he researched and what he talks about in the book, which I think is really smart and it makes sense also given my my research and what I know about polymath. And that is that specializing too early, although it sounds like it would set you up for success according to society standards and give you sort of early edge and an advantage by specializing very early, maybe even as a child, that it can backfire. Because if you don't have a sampling period, which is what David Epstein calls it, if you don't have enough of a sampling period to really decide what you like, and you just specialize in something because you think it's prestigious or it will pay off later or your parents want to, it can often lead to wanting to quit and wanting to give up. And so that idea of having an edge by specializing early can really sort of put you behind if you just end up quitting because you're not really passionate about it. But, regardless of being middle class or or wealthy or sort of, struggling financially. I think that the important thing is to take whatever resources you do have, or as a parent, take whatever resources you can provide to your child and expose them as broadly as you can. And resources may mean going to the library or looking things up on the internet or finding free resources in your community or meeting friends who are from different cultures and backgrounds and who have different perspectives. There are all different kind of ways to expose yourself. The idea here is to do it on purpose and be thoughtful about it and be broad. It's also important to be deep and to have depth and expertise at some point, but especially with young kids. And as a mother myself, I've got a 3-year-old daughter. I mean, my goal for the now and for the foreseeable future is to just really expose my daughter to as many different experiences as I can and let her pick what she's passionate about and then be supportive once she really identifies what she wants to delve into more.
That makes sense, and definitely appreciate that. So just kind of going off of those benefits, maybe, and you said, you talked about a little bit about like delayed specialization, but yeah, and that might seem like a detriment to people if they think about time as kind of a constraint.
Mm-hmm.
But what are the benefits that society can potentially gain from promoting polymathy, maybe at like a macro
Mm-hmm.
level?
Well, right now, in terms of how can polymaths benefit society, even though we're talking at the macro level, I still sort of think at the meso and micro level as well. So individuals and organizations kind of make up the society. And so it's hard to really separate how does a society improve without thinking about, organizations or groups of people and also individuals. One thing I do want to highlight is right now, the way organizations hire is essentially everybody needs to be a specialist. And in fact, that's the way we're told to apply for jobs is you read the job description, the advertisement, and then you edit and censor your resume to make it tell a story that matches this very narrow job description. So you're not actually able to just bring your full self and all of your skills and interests and background honestly. You got to kind of start off with the storytelling, having a narrative of specialization. And while I believe specialists can be very effective and powerful for organizations in certain roles, for example, roles that are well defined, very routine, that have, as David Epstein says, kind learning environments, specialists can be great. And this gets to sort of your question about how could society benefit more at the macro level. When there are organizational positions that require innovation, when there are positions that are not stable and routine, that are on the edge, that are in VUCA environments, that stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, or ambiguous, or when there are wicked problems to be solved or harsh learning environments, that's where you need someone who has a lot of tools in their toolkit, like a polymath. Someone who can build bridges and seek synthesis between disciplines in order to come up with new innovative solutions. And so, if organizations could figure out this puzzle, which positions do polymaths make sense in strategically and which don't, and then hire accordingly, attract candidates accordingly, because the way you attract a specialist may be very different from how you would attract a polymath. Or how do you retain people differently who are specialists versus polymath? Very different. How do you develop polymathy in people who want to have that sort of talent? If organizations can figure this out, I really believe it could take organizations and therefore the larger society to the next level. So for me, the society at the macro level can benefit when it figures out how to appreciate and leverage polymathic talent, which, by the way, I think is in our nature. I don't think specialization is in our nature. you alluded to it earlier, in the Renaissance period, we had a lot of new knowledge that humans developed, and it sort of became too much for most people to master. So we created a sort of intellectual division of labor, like Ford's assembly line, and we decided to know more and more about less and less, and no one person really being able to know it all. And it's still the case. No one person can know it all, but polymath sort of push the envelope and say, well, I can't know it all, but I'm going to know as much as I can in whatever field or disciplines I'm passionate about. So I really think that's the normal, natural human state, is to be curious and open and explore and sort of become a master of your own life and your own experience. But for the sake of efficiency, and for the sake of dealing with lots of information overload, we sort of lost sight of our nature. And I hope that we can find it again.
Yeah. And that makes sense. It's one of these things where there's a lot of information and a lot of new knowledge being created, but the connections between those knowledge aren't being as exposed as maybe they possibly could be.
Mm-hmm.
So in with that in mind, how do you uh, how can we tailor education to enhance the skill sets of those polymaths further,
Mm-hmm.
I guess?
Yeah, this came up with a number of my interviewees talking about their educational experiences and sort of the frustration they had with their educational experiences. So here are a few things I heard from them. One, in elementary grade, junior high, high school, they did learn about different subjects, of course, but there were no connections made between the disciplines. And so one of the things I heard from the polymaths I interviewed was it'd be really helpful to have a more holistic learning, to have more explicit connections made between the disciplines I'm learning. And that may mean, okay, I'm taking physics and I'm taking music, so we're going to build a violin and see how these two subjects connect. Or, we're taking chemistry and an art class, so we're going to learn about the chemical combinations and the makeup of pigments or something like that. Those types of bridges could be built between the disciplines, but they almost never are, which is unfortunate. Um,
Mm.
Another thing the schools could do is organize themselves in such a way that allowed for more self-directed learning. So less, here's what we require you to memorize and know, but what are you curious about? And how can we create an environment where you can explore and learn on your own? And I'm guessing, I don't know, but I'm guessing self-directed learning, something that you learn about because you're really curious, is going to stick in your mind so much better than something you're just memorizing and you hate it and you just have to do it to check a box. So, in terms of learning and retention and being able to leverage the information you have, if schools could adjust to allow for more self directed learning, I think that would be a really strategic move. And, also, let's quit telling the story that everybody has to specialize and focus narrowly. Maybe that works and is joyful and wonderful for some people, but let's stop telling the story that everybody has to do that, because it's not true and it's not strategic for our longer term future as a society.
Yeah. I completely agree with these things when I look at like my past education and then just kind of thinking about like, oh, what could have helped me identify what I like earlier in my life.
Mm-hmm.
But and I guess another thing, we just mentioned like not everybody has to specialize. Yeah, there are some people that would love to just be the best guitar player in the world, but then there's other people who want to create incredible music, and then they learn multiple talents
Mm-hmm.
within the band, right?
Right.
So there's different goals with everybody in mind. But yeah, maybe tailoring the education system to not say that everybody has to specialize, but maybe you can generalize more.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so then I guess like my next question off of that is can being a polymath make life more interesting? And have you seen anything done on the kind of effect that specialization can have on the human psyche then?
So, based on my research, I would say that being a polymath can definitely make life more interesting for sure, because you're having more broader exposure to ideas, to environments, to different types of people, to different careers and hobbies. At the same time, that it can also make life harder. And that's pretty much because of the society we live in and the age we live in that says, if you want to be successful, you have to specialize. So it makes life richer, but it also can be hard because society is using this kind of old school model where with the intellectual division of labor, like Ford's assembly line, and we're in the 21st century now, and that approach is not going to work for the long term in terms of being strategic and innovative and more holistic in advancing our society. My opinion, and I don't have evidence for this per se, but just based off of what I know about polymathy and specialization and my own personal opinion, is that for most people, maybe not for all people, because certainly there may be people out there who truly love being narrow and focused and specialized, and that's all they ever want to do, and more power to them. But for me and for I think many people, specialization sort of limits the fullness of their humanity. It can turn us into little cogs in big wheels, and it diminishes the fullness and breadth of what we can experience both professionally and personally. And given the fact that our work takes up the majority of our waking hours for so many years, it's such a shame to think that our experiences might be narrow and focused just because society tells us that's the way we have to be. So, yeah, if people want to be narrow and focused from their own volition and not society's pressure, great. But if you don't want to be that way, my message is that's okay. It's okay to not be a specialist. That doesn't make you weird. That makes you human because you're curious and you want to learn and have broad experiences and be open to the fullness of life. Openness to experience, by the way, is something that has been written about a lot in the scholarly literature. And polymaths are very open to experiences. And in a way, I think this is almost like an openness to life itself. Because what is life if not stringing together a bunch of experiences? So for me personally, and for a lot of people that I know, the idea of being expansive, being broad, exploring the fullness of what your life has to offer, including your career, but also outside of your career, that's how you forge and create a good life for yourself. So by kind of taking ownership for your own experience, not just saying, oh, I'm going to do what society says, because that's the safe route.
Mm. I've often thought the same thing about having a string of experiences become the life that is fulfilling.
Mm-hmm.
And I do want to kind of touch on that maybe a little bit, just in terms of what you noticed when studying polymaths. Did you find that they were doing, maybe doing more of like a multitasking approach where there's multiple projects going on in their life at one time? Maybe they have a full-time job and then they're working on, building furniture during like their off hours, or is it more like, okay, for 10 years I do this, then for 10 years I do this, then, and you have a 40-year career and you just split it up? How did you see any patterns with that?
Yeah. So it shows up in different ways. You can be a polymath because you are an expert in A for 5 years, and then you switch gears and become an expert in B for 10 years. And then maybe you go back to A, or maybe you mix A and C, or, there's all different kind of combinations. But I think for probably the majority of the polymaths I interviewed, they tend to be people who juggle. They juggle many interests at the same time. They don't want to sort of focus for a few years in one area and then pick something different and focus on that for a few years. They tend to be people who juggle. And this is actually one of the challenges of being a polymath, is because you're so curious and so interested and are so passionate about pursuing the things that you're interested in, that you end up having to really think carefully about, how do I juggle my limited time? How do I prioritize? So that is a challenge of being a polymath. And like I said, I'd say that for most of the polymaths I know, they do juggle different interests at the same time. But that's not to say that for someone who takes a different approach, they could also be a polymath as well.
Hmm. And so, yeah, we always I guess that's like another part of society is, right, like a multitasking, right? Everybody says like, oh, if you don't focus on one thing at one time, you're never going to get everything done. Which could be true, but like in a lot of cases, you get really bored if you're just working on one thing for 14 hours a day every day. And so I think like the juggling aspect is, a term that can be used, but it's more like, a series of different projects going on at once, right? Like I think of even at like a professional organization, like a business or something, you have like a project manager who manages all these different things that are going on. And maybe people approach and like you said, polymaths might approach their life in that way. Just to touch on, like, so like, who would be, I know I mentioned Leonardo da Vinci, but who are some other, prominent examples of polymaths, maybe from history but then also maybe like in the modern sense that we could look at and listenership could study maybe if they wanted.
Yeah, Leonardo da Vinci, Benjamin Franklin, those are a couple good examples from history. In terms of, people living today who might be celebrities, a couple examples I might highlight that aren't typically written about if you Google modern day celebrity polymaths. Someone whose name I might add to that list would be Arnold Schwarzenegger, actually. If you look at his Wikipedia page, you'll see he has at least 4 different careers listed: a bodybuilding career, an acting career, a political career, and a business career. And, he really did very, very well in all of those areas. Part of what I like about Arnold Schwarzenegger's story as well is that he had a somewhat of a difficult childhood in Austria, but he did not let that stop him from pursuing his dreams and really taking ownership for his experience. So I like to highlight him. Another quick celebrity example is Dr. Brian May. He has a PhD, I believe, in physics. He is a rocket scientist for NASA, and he was a member of the band Queen. So that's another example of someone with a really broad skill set, kind of making up his own rules and defining his own path in a very unique way. One thing I do want to sort of say, though, is that you don't have to be a celebrity or creative genius or eminent, a creative legend to be a polymath. Certainly, to be a polymath, you do have to have some level of excellence. It's more than just sort of dabbling or trying something once or twice. To be a polymath, you need to be broad, but you also need to have, excellence along with being broad. So just to share some real world examples of people who aren't celebrities, I'm going to highlight a couple from my research. And unfortunately, I cannot share their real identities with you, but I can sort of share a little bit about their stories. So someone that I called Levi in my dissertation, he has a PhD in physics. He's a physics professor and a physics researcher, but he's also a professional magician. So he is a theater and magic professor, as well as being a physics professor. He hosts his own podcast, and his hobbies include carpentry, cooking, a wide variety of sports, video games, bartending, reading, and refereeing for women's roller derby. And he's also super into trivia. So that's one example of like a real person. He's not a celebrity, but he sort of made up his own rules about what his life was going to look like in all of the diversity and variety that I just described. Another example, someone I called Hunter in my dissertation, has a bachelor's degree in physics, a master's in electrical engineering. He had a multi-year career in the nanotechnology field as an engineer and a scientist. He actually holds numerous patents related to nanotechnology and has published over 15 different articles and scholarly journals related to nanotechnology. And he also has a bachelor's in music. And he's a very successful professional musician at a very prestigious opera house. He's an adjunct professor of music as well. And his hobbies include home improvement, exploring the outdoors, and writing. So, those are a couple additional examples of real people who forged their own path to create the life of their dreams.
Yeah, and so that is amazing. How did you? So and maybe just this is more of like a X's and O's academic question, but how did you go about finding all of these people?
Yeah, I used what's called snowball sampling. It's also called chain or network sampling, where within my own network, I sort of sought out a few people I knew who were this way, very accomplished, very polymathic, and then they recommended me to other people like this, or I would find people, through internet searches and then seek them out. Could I interview you? There were a number of people who were willing to be interviewed by me, but they didn't quite meet the search criteria that I was looking for. So yeah, it was just a matter of finding people who are very, very broad, who have had they're experts in both the arts and sciences, who have had totally disparate career fields in both the arts and sciences, to a level that I felt was quite accomplished. And of course, that's sort of vague. What does accomplished mean? But these are people who I wanted to feel like if you met them at a happy hour, you would be like, wow, they really have their act together. They've, worked hard and really are pretty impressive. So basically, I sought these people out. I used my network to try to find these people and then use their networks. And so I had multiple snowballs, as we say, that led to my interview participants.
Interesting. Yeah, that was just kind of tickling my own fancy there. But I just want to talk about a little bit about maybe the cultural approach to polymathic learning. So do you think and maybe there's like you said, there's not a lot of research on this, but are there maybe certain countries that are better at producing polymaths than others? And I don't know. That's kind of something that I was thinking about.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And you're exactly right. We do not have enough research on polymathy, sadly. That is an area that I would love to explore more, but right now we don't know the answer. There may certainly be countries, there may be universities, there may be organizations that are promoting this way of living and working and being, but we don't know. We don't have enough information. So it's definitely an area worthy of future study for sure.
And then I just want to talk about maybe a little bit more of a tactical question again. So where else do you think polymaths can be effective outside of the macro problems that maybe are affecting education and maybe hiring? So, for instance, I think you kind of have to be a polymath to be an effective CEO of a business because you're managing so many different types of people and you're managing a lot of different problems in various different industries potentially.
Mm-hmm.
So that was just one of the examples of a title, right? And that's like the top of the business world, right? If you're in that career path. But so I guess back to my question: do you think there's ways that polymaths can be effective in those types of roles, and or what roles are there where they could be potentially effective?
Right. There definitely is some evidence that polymathic types may be more effective in leadership roles, and that's because they are better at environmental scanning, which helps them make better strategic decisions. And even if you think of a polymathic type managing a team of diverse people, that leader, because of their wide toolkit and breadth of various experiences previously, may be able to speak sort of multiple languages. I don't mean literal languages, but I mean sort of professional languages, and be able to make linkages and connections, have a broader network in their role as a leader. And that helps them to translate and synthesize and make sense of lots of information better because they've been more broadly exposed. So there definitely is reason to believe that polymaths can make great leaders. That's not to say every single polymath that exists would be great in a leadership role, but it could definitely be a strategic trait to look for in someone who maybe also has other skills that would make them very appropriate in a leadership role. There's also evidence that polymaths, I think, I don't have the best data on this, but just from my interviews with polymaths, many of them, out of their frustration with organizations not appreciating their multidisciplinary talent, not knowing how to leverage it, not welcoming it, many polymaths became entrepreneurs. They decided, I'm going to employ myself because then I can bring my whole self to work and really leverage my talent more fully. One other sort of role there was evidence for is inventors. So there was an article I found that basically showed that inventors do better when they have a multidisciplinary skill set. So to answer your question, definitely leadership positions, entrepreneurial roles, and also inventor type of positions. Those are just a few examples of where polymaths can be really effective.
Interesting. So then in your role now, you are working a lot with leadership. How are you leveraging your previous experience and research to, how are you applying that to your role?
This is a tricky question. I would love to bring my polymath expertise into the federal government at the same time that there's this intellectual property consideration. And I've been advised by general counsel where I work in the federal government to just keep a clear and distinct line between my work as a scholar and my work in the federal government. So it's sort of a sad reality. If I represent the federal government as a polymath expert, then over time it may appear that my expertise is owned by the government, which I want to be careful about. So that's sort of a tricky question. Yeah. I'm still sort of navigating that. I'm new to all of this. I just finished my doctorate last year. I'm still sort of finding my way and how to leverage and make use and still sort of stay active in the field at the same time that, for now anyway, I still have a career in the federal government, and how to juggle, how to juggle, like a polymath, how to make sense and navigate in these two different worlds.
Gotcha. Yeah, and so just so people know, what is your role at the federal government? Or you are working in leadership, right? Like
Yeah, so the place where I work for the federal government, it's a really cool place a lot of people don't know about. It's called the Center for Leadership Development. We're by government for government, and we offer a variety of interventions, most of which are training programs that may range from a half a day to, a month-long program. And we try to make government better, one leader at a time. And our audience is not political appointees. So we're focusing on the people who kind of, in my mind, the backbone of our government, the people who stay regardless of who's elected, regardless of who's president. These are the people who make sure, our roads are kept up and our army is ready in the event of a war, and people who keep our national parks open. Like, these are the people who keep, the United States a great place to live. So that's our audience. It's sort of the flip side of the coin of the political realm, but also a very important, area in government to consider, that there is this very important group in the federal government that is not political, but still is really, really important. to keeping the wheels turning in our nation.
So yeah, just to be clear, it's leadership development for those who are not in elected positions.
Exactly.
Okay. Awesome. So this was great. I feel like I have so many questions still, but but I think it's I think when I go back and listen to this, I'll start to put some pieces together in my brain, and so will others. So just is there anything else that maybe we didn't touch on throughout the whole interview that you would like to talk about?
The only other thought, which I like to sort of emphasize and share with people, and I think it's an interesting point and a valuable contribution that my research made, and that is around this idea of diversity. So when we talk about diversity in our society, we typically are talking about groups of people and how can that group be diverse from a gender perspective, gender identity, race, male female perspective, and that all is important and that all matters. But what human diversity looks like goes beyond those considerations. In fact, one of the things that my work did is it sort of equated this idea of so within one individual, intra personal diversity with polymathy, because they're essentially the same construct. A polymath is someone who is diverse within themselves as a person. And it's a really important, it's important to think about. I think most people appreciate the importance of diversity. It's a sensitive subject. It's important. It gets a lot of attention, but we need to think about that diversity goes beyond groups of people and can be thought of and applied at the individual level as well. And in fact, it showed up in the scholarly literature originally, intrapersonal diversity did, when looking at the human gut microbiome. In fact, in the science literature around the gut microbiome, the articles that you'll find will say more intrapersonally diverse people in the gut microbiome are healthier. And my personal opinion is that intrapersonal diversity, making someone healthier, is not just applicable in the gut microbiome. That is also the case for other areas of our personhood beyond the gut, and that diversity matters more than just in groups. So that's one sort of thing I like to highlight, that intrapersonal diversity exists, and we should appreciate it and think about it so we can have a more holistic understanding of the diversity construct instead of only looking at it at the meso and macro levels. Also look at it at the micro level. And then just the final thought is, polymaths are really a good example of taking ownership for your life, curating your life thoughtfully and on purpose, being open to chance and circumstance and what life brings your way, but living life on purpose and being broad. And I like to say, curating your life thoughtfully. So that's one of the things I really love about the polymathic people I meet, is that, and also the polymathic people I interviewed, is that they really seem to have taken ownership for their experience and don't just follow society's narrative because it's the right thing to do or something. They really live life on their own terms, and I think that's really awesome.
That both of those things were. I'm so glad I asked that last question because I think it really ties it up nicely to see that we are talking about diversity in a lot of different ways from a macro level, ethnicities, gender, etc. But when we look at like the individual on a micro level, that's what makes us human, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and it's good to think of it from that perspective, and then just having a more fulfilling life is also the way that you do that is you make your own decisions about the projects that you're going to take on and the life that you want to curate for yourself, as you would say, right?
Yeah. And what answer to that question could be more important than than asking, how do I live life well? How do I make the most of my human experience that I have? Who knows if we'll ever have it again? We're here, we have this life, and let's make the most of it. And polymaths are a great example of people who are doing just that.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. This was a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Yeah. If you want to be found, where can people find you?
Yeah, I've got a website called lessoncollector.com. You can email me at polymathsplace@gmail.com. I've got a Facebook group called Polymaths Place and a YouTube channel called Polymaths Place. So I'm out there. If you Google my name, Angela Cotellessa, I don't think there's another Angela Cotellessa in the world that I'm aware of. So you will probably find me without too much trouble.
Awesome. Yeah, I will put all of those links in the show notes for sure. And again, thank you so much for this. I am endlessly curious about this subject, and it sparked so many thoughts in my brain about where I can make different connections on polymathy and other aspects of life. So
yeah, I love it.
Keep going deeper. So and I appreciate that, everything that you're doing. And thank you again for coming on.
Thank you so much. It was great to talk with you.